Well, good morning. So glad to be here and to share with everyone. And get my papers ready. Okay, I want to start by asking you, who would you consider, thank you, to be a revolutionary in our world, or in the history, in perhaps recent history, just to cut it down. Just yell it out to me. Martin Luther King, yes? Che Guevara. I don't really know a lot about him, but anyway, whatever. He was considered to be a revolutionary, yes. Anyone else? Got a woman? Is there a woman out there? I've got a woman. It's all right, you can relax. William Booth was not a woman. Okay. Don't cry for me, Argentina, that lady. Evita. Okay. Right, so we've got some women, we've got some men who are revolutionaries. They were game changers in our world, but we've also got people who only made small changes, but they still made changes. And this particular woman I just want to mention to you, from the early 1800s, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Fry, a Christian woman. She particularly worked hard for reform for women in prison. But she also dealt with other charitable organisations and dealt with other kinds of reform. She worked hard for women to be given opportunities for employment, particularly if they had been in prison. And so she went into women's prisons and she tried to help with... and back then it was a terrible thing to be in prison. And, I don't know if you've ever heard of debtors' prisons, but these people were thrown in jail until they could pay their debts. Doesn't really make a great deal of sense, does it? So it was very difficult, and difficult particularly for women. But Elizabeth Fry, this is the thing that she did. She also worked hard for women who were being transported. So a number of women who came to Australia on those convict ships were supported and helped by Elizabeth Fry. And what she did was she gave them a bag of useful things. And quite often what was contained in that bag was sewing things. And this is how I came to know about it, because I have an interest in sewing. So she gave them a bag of little bits of fabric, thread, needles, that sort of stuff. And there's actually a quilt in Australian history that is tucked away in a museum in Canberra. It only comes out once a year. It's called the Rajah quilt, and it was sewn by a bunch of women on a ship coming to Australia as convicts, and they probably used their bag of useful things to make that quilt. And again, I have an interest in quilting, so that's how I know that. I've seen the Rajah quilt. You only get to see it once a year because it is so fragile. But this woman, Elizabeth Fry, came out of a wealthy place and said, I need to do something to make life different for these women who are in a very hard place. That's what revolution's about, I think, when we make a change, a life change for people. Okay, so my next question then is, do we think of Jesus as a revolutionary? If we think about Jesus, the sort of person he was, do we think of him that he was a revolutionary? Well, he was. He absolutely was. I sometimes think we don't think about him in those terms because we're so used to hearing about him and hearing the sorts of things that he said. But in the culture in which he lived, he was absolutely a revolutionary. He turned things upside down. His teaching, his practice turned many of the accepted social ideas on their heads. And he actually was quite offensive to many of the people in his time. And just as an example of this, we have the woman at the well. Jews didn't speak to Samaritans. She was a Samaritan woman. She was a woman of bad reputation. And so on 2 counts, Jesus approached her and spoke with her when any other man or any other Jewish man would not have done so. And he was actually quite kind to her, if you read that story. Mary, of Mary and Martha fame. Mary was invited to sit at his feet, at the feet of a teacher, and be taught by him. Women in that culture didn't get education opportunities. Not like us, we get to go to school, we get to go to uni, we get to do masters and PhDs and all that sort of thing if we want to. Those women, they got to sweep the floor. That's all they got to do, really. And that's what Martha wanted to do. But Mary, she wanted to learn, and Jesus gave her that opportunity. He was revolutionary for women in that culture. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, people despised tax collectors. They didn't go round their house for dinner. They stayed away from them and they called them names. Jesus interacted with lepers, with people with other illnesses. He allowed them to touch him. He healed them. He loved them. In that culture, they were sent to the outskirts of town. They were made to live outside so that their diseases wouldn't be spread around. I suppose that makes a bit of sense, but they were outcast. If you had a disease, you had a skin disease, any of that sort of thing, out you go. Not interested in you. He forgave the paralysed man who was lowered through that roof, and everyone was like, what? He doesn't get to say, I forgive you. Only God gets to say that. Jesus was a revolutionary. He said and did things, and people are all going, hang on, you're not allowed to talk like that. You're not allowed to do stuff like that. The woman caught in adultery, Jason mentioned her a couple of weeks ago. And the thing he said I thought was quite funny. He said everybody slunk away. And they did, didn't they? They slunk away when they were challenged about their own sin. How many gutsy people in public get to challenge or even would challenge other people and say, well, he who is without sin can throw the first stone? How many gutsy people are there out there like that? Jesus scandalised people with his revolutionary teaching. Today, we're talking about Jesus' teaching on judging. And this is going to be a little bit of a scandal, I think, as we think about this, because in our world today, this is a big issue. What we think and what we say about other people and other people's lifestyles and their practices. It's a difficult and a very broad and complex issue. And I am not going to be able to say everything there is to say about it, and you'll be thankful for that. In about, 15 minutes' time, you'll be like, okay, I've heard enough about this now. And so what I want to say right up front is, if this is difficult and you understand the complexities of this in your own life and you have issues with this, please don't go away and think, oh, well, she didn't really touch on that and I'm still no wiser. If you have questions, please come and talk to me about them, because I think in many cases, it's a case by case that we have to sort of nut out how Jesus' teaching really applies in particular cases. So come and talk to me. I'm sure Jason would be very happy for you to talk to him. In actual fact, we spoke yesterday afternoon and I said I was going to tell you to talk to him. So he would be very happy to help you work out how this works in your life and in your particular situation. And so in this issue, Jesus, I think, again, he overturned accepted thought and practice. One of the examples I want to give about how he did this was in this first passage that's going to come up on the screen, the teaching that's called the Sermon on the Mount. So now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The people Jesus is talking about here, the poor, the grieving, the meek, those who are genuinely looking for a relationship with God rather than just practicing religion. The merciful, peacemakers rather than peacekeepers. The persecuted. These people were not held in high esteem in that culture. These people, like to use a pretty derogatory term, these people were considered losers. If you were meek or poor or, any of these things, if you were merciful, mercy was not in the Roman Empire, mercy was not a thing. Nobody was merciful. It was like every man for himself. In that culture, so Jesus is calling these things out and he's saying these people are going to be blessed. These people are going to have God's favour poured out on them. That's what blessing means. God's favour poured out on them. So those who are not held in high esteem, they get God's blessing. Whereas in the culture of the day, it was the wealthy, the educated, the high achievers, the go-getters, those who observed religious rules and they dressed and acted in that way, in those accepted ways, in those ways that everybody else go, oh, there's a great guy going down the street, look at the outfit he's got on, and he's, standing on the corner praying all these fabulous prayers. They're the people who were held in high esteem. But they are not the people that Jesus held in high esteem. That's turning everything on its head. It's saying that stuff, not important. This stuff, the most important. And there's a whole bunch of judgment there, isn't there? So the guys walking down the street with the fancy outfit, we don't care about that. The people who are merciful, the people who understand that they need God, they're the people we think are really important. There's a whole bunch of judgment going on in what Jesus is teaching here. And this is an example of how countercultural Jesus was, but it also sets us up for how we're going to approach this issue of judging and making judgments in the world in which we live today. So in this passage, we pick up right at the beginning that Jesus is actually speaking to his disciples. He's teaching his followers. He's not teaching the crowd. He saw the crowd and he went away from the crowd and he started to teach his own followers. So he's imparting his heart to his people who are these are the guys who are actually going to build the church. These are the guys who are there in Acts, who are starting the early church, the people whose footsteps we follow in. And he's teaching these guys, it's not those fancy fellows walking down the street with the outfit who are important. It's the people who are coming after me, people who care about, and this is God speaking, not me. It's people who the poor in spirit, people who understand their need for God. Right, so this teaching of Jesus setting us up for what his heart is, how he wants his people to understand him, his character, the way he wants to spread that around. But for us, this is difficult because we live in a world, it's complicated. Because we live in this world where you're not allowed to make judgments. If you pass an opinion, you get yourself into deep water And if you stand on that opinion and get your placards out and all that sort of stuff, you'll get tomatoes or eggs or something thrown at you. So what we believe, what we think, what we understand to be God's way from the Bible, it's not really accepted out there. So how do we navigate this, what we believe, what we think are values to live by, and what everybody else in the world thinks are the right values to live by? How do we do this? And it is difficult because judgments are being made all the time. So, for instance, if I back my car into yours in the parking lot and I drive away and don't leave my information and an opportunity for you to get in touch with me and me to pay for the damage I've done, well, that's a low act, isn't it? Everyone agrees. That is a low act. That's a judgment. That person is low for doing that terrible thing. On the news the other day, there was a fellow and he'd done something wrong. I'll tell you about that in a sec. And the cops have got him, the police, and they're walking him down the street and he's got his hand things on, the handcuffs are on, and the cops are walking him down the street, and the little journalists are all trotting down beside him and they're going, "What were you thinking when you did that?" "Oh, that was a low act." These are the journalists saying, and I thought, oh, we need new journalists. That's what I thought. There's a judgment for you. What the guy had done was you know how there's been all these data breaches with Medibank and Optus, and there's now another one who tried to keep it on the lowdown, but they've been found out. This young fella, he's about 18 years old, he decided to get in on the act and he got hold of all that information that's been downloaded and started texting people saying, if you don't put $2,000 in my bank account and here's my bank account details, then I'm going to release your information to whoever, I don't know. So the police got onto him in about 2 minutes flat because they tracked him through his bank information, and then he gets arrested and carted off. And the journalists are trotting along going, "Oh, that's a low act, that's a low act." Well, it is, isn't it? Like, if you're one of those people who's had their information breached by these criminals, and there's another judgment, they're criminals for doing that, well, that actually is true because they've broken the law. That is a low act. But every time we say that's a low act, we have made a judgment. And who is the authority that says that is actually a low act? I mean, I can say that, but what authority do I have to make a declaration of what's right and what's wrong? And that's the complication in our world. Who gets to say? Now, for a very, very long time, we've lived in a world where it was kind of accepted that God got to say. But now we don't live in that world any longer. People do not accept that God has a say in our world and that his rules and regulations, his 10 Commandments or any of that, or any of the things that Jesus taught. They go, "Oh, he was a good teacher, but we'll take or leave the bits that we like or the bits we don't like." So nobody really has authority in our world anymore, except Christians don't have any authority, so it's like anything we say gets jumped on. Okay, I'm just looking at the time, need to move on. Right, so how do we navigate this complicated issue when there's no real authority? We certainly are not the authority. This is what Jesus says, Matthew chapter 7. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way as you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." there are two groups of people. There are Christians and there are non-Christians. And when Jesus gives this teaching, he's giving it to the Christians or his followers. And so he's teaching his disciples, his people, that we have to be very careful when we look around and say, oh. We have to be careful about that because we are equally as sinful. And we know that, don't we? That's the great leveller in our world. We are all as bad as each other. So look at the person beside you and say, I'm as bad as you are. Okay, no, not allowed to say that. No, I'm better than you. No, we are all sinners and we are all as bad as each other, but we are all as forgiven as each other. We are all as forgiven as each other. And so when we start looking around, we have to be very careful that we've taken the plank out of our own eye before we start looking at any specks in anybody else's eyes. Jesus doesn't judge non-Christians. He loves them, he heals them, he forgives them, he's gracious and merciful to them. The people he comes down hard on are the ones who claim to be people of faith. He comes down really hard on the religious leaders, those who are all about observing the rules and regulations, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, those sorts of people you read about in the Bible. The important point, I think, that we have to realise is we actually can't enforce Christian values on non-Christian people. We can live by those values, but if they don't belong to God, we can't expect them to understand them even, or certainly not live by them. And so we can't apply our morals and our ethics to people outside of the kingdom of God or outside of faith community. But for the religious leaders, Jesus unloads on them. Matthew 23, he calls them names. Whitewashed tombs, a brood of vipers. Whoa. Blind, hypocrites, greedy, self-indulgent, wicked. He makes all these judgments on religious people. Not saying that we should make these sorts of judgments or we should say these sorts of things to people, but there is a place for judgment in the community of faith. That's what I'm saying. That's what Jesus did. He made judgments on people of faith. And when I'm saying judgment, not condemnation, there is a difference there. And so what Jesus is really doing is he's calling out sinfulness. He's calling it out, and he's calling it really to the attention of the people who did it. He's not calling it to anybody else's attention, although they do happen to be in public, but he's calling it to their attention. He's calling it out. He actually had the power to be condemning if he wanted to, because he was God. We don't have that. So we cannot say, for instance, because you did that, you are going to hell. That's condemnation. We can say, you have done the wrong thing and you need to turn your life around, but we have to say that in a particular way, and I'll get to that in a sec. So Jesus calls out hypocrisy, he calls out intolerance, he calls out a number of things. But do we ever see Jesus condemn anybody? I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that. I didn't think that through before I said it. But ultimately, God is the righteous judge. God is, and the Old Testament is full of that. I'm sure the New Testament is too. God is the one who will judge in fairness. And it says this in Psalm 9, in Psalm 7. It says God is the righteous judge who will judge with equity and fairness. But the point is, for us, we need to keep a measure of holiness within our community of faith. Our job is to be a light to the world. But if we're all doing stuff in here that they're all doing out there, how are we going to be a light? We're meant to, and Jason and Tara spoke about this a couple of weeks ago when they talked about standing apart. Our job is to be holy as God is holy, so that we shine a light into a dark and confused world. And so in the community of faith, there is a place for sin to be called out. The thing about that, though, is that we have to do that very carefully. And Jesus, when he teaches on sin in the community of faith, he teaches on it in Matthew 18, and he says this: if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. No gossipy passing around the story. There's got to be some evidence. There's got to be some witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. How were pagans and tax collectors treated by Jesus? He spoke the gospel to them. He loved them. He went and had dinner with them. Well, there's another passage in the Bible that talks about Christians not having fellowship with people who call themselves Christians but are doing the wrong thing. But I think it all still comes back to that we treat them with love and compassion and kindness and mercy, and we don't kick them out. No kicking people out. Although at one point it does talk about expelling the wickedness. I think that's one of those difficult things that we have to figure out how exactly we do that. And so when we talk about judgment in the church, we're talking about habitual sin, not one-off, because we all do. We're all sinners. We're all doing something or other throughout our week, and we all have to repent of that. But if there is someone who says, no, I'm going to do this, and I don't care what anyone else says, and I don't even care what the Bible says or what Jesus or God says, I'm doing this. That's an habitual sin, and that has to be called out. But you have to do that in relationship. I'm not going to come to someone I don't know, I've never met, never spoken to, and say, oh, hang on a sec, you're doing the wrong thing and, that's terrible and whatever. No, it's got to be done in relationship. And this is where we go back to what Jesus taught. Blessed are these people and these people and these people. Blessed, he looks at people with compassion, and he looks at people with understanding, and he looks at people with grace and mercy and kindness. Well, they're all fruits of the Spirit, aren't they? Or a lot of them that I've just mentioned. And so when we come to this issue, we come to it as God or as Jesus would come to it. And with a great deal of prayer, we just don't go bursting all over people and saying, well, I'm going to do this and say this and give it to you and let you know what's what about it. We approach in the same sort of way that Jesus would approach. And the other thing about that is the purpose of what we're doing. What's the purpose of calling out sin? It's so that person will be restored, will be brought back into relationship, into a good relationship with their Lord and Saviour. It's all about restoration and reconciliation, which we've already spoken about this morning. It's about bringing people back into relationship. It's not about shoving them away or avoiding them or whatever. And this all takes guts. It all takes guts, Most of us, we want to avoid confrontation. We want to avoid truth-telling. How many times does someone, some incident happens and they fudge the truth because they're not prepared to say what they actually think about it? Now, that can be said in ways that's not offensive, that's not soul-destroying to the person you say it to. But sometimes these things really need to be said. So we have to be careful how we call sin out. We have to be really careful. And the other thing about this is you have to be careful that you're actually calling sin out and not just an unwise decision. See, we often have a different opinion about what's wise and what's not. So you can't go running around saying, oh, that's a dumb decision, oh, that's sinful, when it's actually just a dumb decision in your opinion. So again, very, very careful how we do this. We're not calling out to send people away from us. We're calling them out so they can be restored to God and to us. We're not calling them out for decisions we don't agree with. So, you can see how this kind of can get complex. How do you deal? How do you even think about it? Because what if you really honestly believe that it's a sinful decision, but somebody else is like, no, that's not sinful, that's just not really wise. Yes, it's a matter of conscience, yeah. So sometimes, again, without gossiping or, passing people's information around, we might have to just consult with someone who can help us work through these complicated issues. And I know that I haven't really given a great deal of specific direction, but as you can see, it is very complex. And again, as I said before, if we need to talk about this some more, Jason, myself, bottom line for us here is that we understand God's heart, which is loving, forgiving, compassionate, gracious. This is the first place for us. The first question we ask ourselves when we're confronted by a difficult situation is what did Jesus teach about? Not what he would do, because I think that's too hard for us to know. The way he dealt with situations, it came out of left field a lot of those times. Like that woman caught in adultery, who would know that Jesus would, write in the dirt and then confront everybody in the people at the gathering? Who would know to do that? So what we do actually have, though, is we have God's word. We have what he taught we can go back to. So what did Jesus teach about this? That's our first place. To understand God's heart and God's character, what Jesus' teaching was. And if we have that basic understanding of God's character, it will lead us to a place of grace and mercy and compassion and love when we're dealing with other people and these complex issues. Let me pray.